So joining us on the show from the Speak of the Devils podcast, his name is Brad Denny, the Sun Devil Whisperer. Sir, how are things down in Tempe? The weather is starting to turn up here, which means it's like the ideal season, or you're getting into the ideal season down south.
That's very true. There's actually a couple days from now, 80s in the forecast. We're all about it. So life is pretty good.
So I've only been down there for the Fiesta Bowl last year when it was Oregon, Iowa State. When do you start getting like that weather change? The snowbirds, what do they call them? The snowbirds from the northern states come down. Everyone's there to play golf. Like, when does that start to happen in Arizona?
Right about, a little bit maybe before Halloween. I mean, the heat's lasting a little bit longer and longer each year and such. But yeah, it's about October. I mean, once we get into November through about March, there's really no better place. I mean, just like every day is like sunny, mid 70s. Granted, we certainly pay the price, the other half of the year. That's our penance. But yeah. Man, it's really about to be a really good time down in the valley.
That's like the trade-off, right? I found it when I moved to Oregon. I was like, wow, these summers are gorgeous. I came here in April when I first moved here. And I was like, man, is it always like this? And someone's like, just wait till November. Then November came. It's gray for 4 months straight. I'm like, all right, I get where the penance is up here too. So I guess we all kind of get it, and it evens out. Your Indeed. Arizona State Sun Devils down there, man, have been quite the revelation after, I think, what one could argue was a turbulent last month run up to the year amid NCAA investigations and coaches on administrative leave. Things have kind of seemed to stabilize down there. And looking at this past week against UCLA, what I had said on our show here was that this was going to be the weekend where you'd figure out a lot about who ASU was. They had 3 subpar opponents, and that BYU game, this was going to be the game where you figured out who ASU kind of is or will be going into the rest of the year. Was that the general vibe going into this past week? And if so, what are they going into week 6 in the last half of the season?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like the UCLA game was going to be a real indicator of where this program is, because you back up a couple weeks, ASU goes up to Provo, plays BYU, and now turns out to be a pretty solid team, but still, that was such a disappointing performance for ASU. They were clearly a better team, but 4 dumb turnovers, 16 penalties, and it was still a 1-score game late in the fourth. So, I mean, they should have won that game. And so the big question coming off that loss was, how is this team going to respond? Because this was a team that was so hyped up, had Rose Bowl or bust expectations all offseason long. All the players, they had so many super seniors come back. Everything had lined up to make this run. And then you have that gut punch of a loss, a self-inflicted gut punch, no less. How is this team going to respond? Coming back home off of that against Colorado, obviously you're not going to learn a whole lot. But then going on the road to face another quality opponent in UCLA, a lot of questions. And some of the big questions about this team, in terms of how's the passing game going to work out? Well, look against UCLA, it looked pretty good. Jaden Daniels looked his best that he has all season. He looked confident in the pocket. He was staying in, going through his reads, something that he didn't do earlier in the year. The receivers made some big plays. Chip Trainum, the running back, came back after missing last several weeks. He made a big time difference. And so the balance there with him and Rashad White out of the backfield, that really helped keep ASU going. I mean, they put up nearly 40 points and looked good. They had their highest yards per play in a single game in almost a decade against UCLA. And then you look over at the defensive side of things, they pitched that second half shutout, and which was even more impressive because UCLA ran 83 plays in that game. That's going to test your depth. And there was a number of key starters that were either out of the lineup altogether or limited for ASU's veteran defense. So you had a lot of young guys had to step in, and they made big plays. Eric Gentry, the freshman linebacker, made that big 4th down stop in the 4th quarter. BJ Green, walk-on, is now tied for the conference lead in sacks. I mean, you have unexpected players making big time plays in big time moments, and so that's starting to answer some of these questions. Now, there were some things against UCLA that were problematic, and special teams especially was very problematic for all season long. But it directly led to 6 points just basically being gifted to UCLA. Penalties were still kind of an issue, not so much in terms of the amount, but in terms of the spots and just kind of the mental errors. There's a couple of illegal substitution penalties, just like penalties you can't make. That okay, you might be able to skate by a week or so, but ultimately, if you don't clean it up, it's going to bite you. But I think ultimately right now we see ASU as a control of the South right now in terms of the standings. Some of the big questions were answered. Some big questions remain unanswered. But right now, every other team in the South has shown a lot of flaws. So I think right now they're got to feel pretty good about where you are.
On a more macro level, and I think this way with Oregon State as well, there's so much of a what if in their non-conference, like what if Oregon State had beaten Purdue? I feel like with Arizona State, there's a lot of the same there. What if they had beaten BYU? Where might they be right now at 5-0, 2-0 in Pac-12 play? At that point, you've got 2 ranked wins under your belt. At this point, I guess it's too late to play that game really. But looking at the rest of the season, every game on this schedule feels very winnable for ASU. Where are they at their most complete right now? And where do you think there are still deficiencies? Like, give me the case for running the table, maybe not undefeated the rest of the way, but running the table in 1 loss potentially versus the case for 2, 3, or even 4 losses the rest of the way.
I think the best case scenario is that the passing game strides that we saw against UCLA and at times a little bit against Colorado really start to continue because they have a lot of talent at wide receiver, just not a whole lot of experience. And we're starting to see some of those younger guys making those big plays. Ricky Pearsall had 4 catches, 132 yards, 2 touchdowns. Zach Hill, interestingly, the offensive coordinator, typically is on the sidelines, but he actually threw out his back in the week leading up to UCLA, went up to the box against the Bruins, and all of a sudden it's ASU's best offensive performance in a long time. So he's going to stay up there. So perhaps that perspective will help him out. But just the balance, if the balance offensively is there, if Chip Trainum can stay healthy, form that lightning and thunder combo with Rashad White. White had a dazzling 50-yard touchdown run against UCLA, getting back to his old self. Because last couple of weeks with Trainum out of the lineup, he had to be more of kind of that workhorse role, and not just something that did not seem to suit him too well. I mean, he was still scoring some touchdowns, but just the overall production, the explosiveness wasn't really there. So I think the best case scenario is that offense really continues to build on the last couple of weeks, continues that balance, and has that ability to hurt people with big plays through the air or on the ground. Because you figure that in any case, ASU's veteran defense is going to be pretty solid and at least one of the best or one of the handful of best units in the conference. On the flip side of things, I think it's just going to be a matter of if they hurt themselves, because where ASU has really gotten themselves in trouble this year is when they've just been their own worst enemy. In the opener, granted it was an FCS opponent, but still they had double-digit penalties. And it was just, even though it was a big win, multi-score win, fans after that game weren't feeling too good because just the performance, because you had this level of expectations, this level of talent and of experience that ASU should not be hanging around with these teams. They should be able to put things away. Even against UCLA, you had those same lingering questions. You had the issues on special teams. You had the penalty issues, just kind of the dumb execution errors. A lot of that falls on coaching. A lot of that falls on some of the younger guys that are playing in big spots. But ultimately, you got to make those plays if you're going to make a run at a Rose Bowl. And you talked about earlier about just BYU. Like, that's a game ASU absolutely should have won if they just stopped shooting themselves in the foot. Like if they didn't have a second team returner take the opening kickoff 8 yards deep out of the end zone, fumbles at the 12, set up BYU immediately. Just kind of like stuff like that. And then even against UCLA at the end of the half, when they get their ace returner DJ Taylor back, 4 seconds left in the half, a punt, just let it roll, go to the half up 4. But no, he tries to make a play on the hop, bounces off his leg. UCLA gets a free gifted 3 points. Just stuff like that, which again you can skate by here or there, but ultimately over the course of a long season, over the grind of Pac-12 play, it's going to cost them if they don't start cleaning those things up, because it's been popping up too frequently, I think, to ignore as completely a trend in the making.
Just as a side note, I'm picturing Zach Hill in the booth. You remember that picture of Hugh Freeze when he was at Liberty and he's like in the gurney and the thumbs up? Like, have you ever thrown your back out before? Like,
surprisingly not, though. And I play
you.
hockey and I'm a goalie, so I don't know how I haven't blown out both ACLs and destroyed my back, but I can only imagine the horror,
dude. So just as an aside, I was covering the 19 Rose Bowl between Oregon and Wisconsin, and I have a bad back from skiing because I competed in freestyle skiing for 10 years, and I put my leg up in the bathroom to dry my leg off after a shower, and my back just went. And the only way I can describe it is like if you've ever had a muscle spasm before, but the muscle spasm is like it's like a gong. Like when you hit a gong and it like vibrates, your whole body is just like emanating pain out of your back, like vibrating. And I'm like, I'm laying on the floor on my back. I'm like trying to lay on my stomach. I'm on my side and I'm sharing the room with our colleague Julian. And I'm sitting there and he knocks on the door and I'm like, don't come in here. He's like, are you decent? I'm like, no. And I might not make it to the game today. And it took me probably an hour to like get myself right. We managed to get on the bus. Like my back's hurting the rest of the day, but like that initial pang of when you throw your back out, you are straight up out of commission. It is.
Oh no.
So that's why I'm picturing Zach Hill in the gurney. Cause like, that's where I would be. I'd be in the gurney, giving the thumbs up down to Herm somewhere on the sideline there. It's tough getting old, man.
Yeah, time remains undefeated, and but maybe it was the pain or the pain pills that he was on, but he called a masterful game with that new perspective up there, and it does sound like that's going to be at least in the near term where he's going to be.
That's his throwing out his back opens up the third eye for play calling. I look at these receivers too. And like you mentioned that a lot of these guys, they're young players that have stepped up a lot. I know drops were a really big concern early in the year with a lot of them. And I can't help but think about the fact that you currently have a receiver coach in the room that's on administrative leave. And with a couple of these coaches I'm curious if there is any discussion down there about how that has changed, altered, hindered, improved development in any direction. Because talking to coaches generally in just the football world, I asked them like, how much does this matter? And a lot of them say it won't matter maybe early on, but it'll matter in like week 7, 8, 9, when guys or coaches have been like filling the duties in those rooms. And eventually the grind of having to fill for those guys will come up at some point. And I'm curious if there's been any discussion about feeling the churn from those guys, or if there's been any improvement on the other side from not having them there.
Yeah, it was certainly one of the big concerns coming into the year with, basically a third of the staff being put on administrative leave. And, I don't know if it was long-term intentional, but ASU did have a number of in-house candidates that did make sense. For the defensive backs, which is a very, very veteran unit, they elevated Donnie Henderson, who was Herm's DC with the Jets. I mean, he spent about 40 years in the game, number of NFL stops, a wealth of experience. But again, with the veteran nature of those DBs, it was almost kind of like just, that group can almost run itself at this point with that defense. But he's provided a good thing. But the questions were really kind of at wide receiver and tight end. You mentioned wide receivers. That was an area that was going to be under a lot of scrutiny this year with the relative inexperience. Prentice Gill, himself a young coach. ASU had a GA on staff that they promoted, Bobby Wade, which is a familiar name to Pac-12 fans. Obviously one of the best receivers in Arizona Wildcat history. He was one of the best prep players in the nation when he played up here in Phoenix in the 90s. He's a guy who wants to get into coaching. But we've seen some strides being made, but you wonder, like, is this going to be the same level of strides? Had there been that continuity? Had there not been that disruption at the tight end group? And again, where you have another young coach, Adam Brenneman, he's on administrative leave, and they elevate Justin Woods, excuse me, who's another young coach who followed Zach Hill from Boise State, a guy who's a former quarterback, but has been around the program, worked with the offensive line last year, but the tight ends are going to be such an important part of the Zach Hill offense. And so having that disruption, you wonder, how's that going to come along? And so far, there's been some progress. Curtis Hodges has, he makes about 2 to 3 catches a game, but usually one is like a big time important reception, either for like 25, 30 yards, or against UCLA, or right after that 4th down stop, when they stop the Bruins at the goal line, they're backed up. First play, 47 yards, gets the Sun Devils to midfield, gets that, game clinching 96-yard eventual touchdown drive underway. So Curtis Hodges made some pretty good strides. I believe he's PFF's #1 ranked tight end in the Pac-12 so far this year, for whatever value you put in the PFF numbers. But in the Case Hatch, who's been kind of the H-back fullback as well, has been absolutely great under Wood's leadership. There's in the opener of the season, there's 6 rushing touchdowns. He had the key block on all 6. He's just been a guy that just, whenever ASU is making a big play offensively, he's usually the guy making that big time key block. But again, there's a lot of those issues that have also kind of persisted. You mentioned drops early in the year. That's been something that's been consistent. There's also been some other penalty issues with those groups that make you wonder, had there been maybe some more continuity of leadership? Would those kind of execution mental errors be a factor? Mm-hmm. It's obviously an unanswerable question, but it's certainly, it has been a disruption, but at some point it seems like there's in certain areas the mitigation has been good, others where it's still very much a work in progress. And, we'll see ultimately down the line, as you mentioned, as the course of the season progresses, will it cost them ultimately, or is it something that these young coaches can continue to step up and these young players can grow into those roles and evolve with them?
For a statistical reference too, Hodges among receivers of 5 receptions or more has the highest yards per catch in that group, 8 for 180 to 22.5. The next best on that list is Andre Johnson at 19.2, 6 and 115. So he's definitely been a big play threat for them this year. Jaden Daniels in that UCLA game, as you had mentioned earlier, really showed up and kind of showed the Pac-12, I think, what peak Jaden Daniels can kind of look like. And I think what peak Jaden Daniels is probably the best quarterback in the conference right now. And I think at his peak, you'd make an argument he's the runaway best quarterback in the conference. What is it that you think is needed to see that consistently out of him? Is that something that is an improvement on his end that needs to be done? Or is this more of getting adequate support in his running game that Chip Trayanum being back really helps with, better pass pro, play calling even? Was it a perfect combination of factors against UCLA? I'm curious what the circumstances will need to be for this to be the Jaden Daniels we see going forward.
Yeah, I think it's a number of factors. Early in the year when he was struggling, it even got to the point where on our podcast, we were talking about, is he just, kind of like game manager plus, because he wasn't taking any shots downfield. He was really kind of just going kind of almost the shades of ASU's last quarterback, Manny Wilkins, just kind of drop back, one read and then run. And, that kind of really came to pass against UNLV, where he had 12 carries, career high and 125 yards rushing. But there were so many plays when you look back at that game that he left downfield. We could have made those plays with his arm, but it was looking real rickety in the pocket a little bit. But those last couple of weeks, just really, he's made a lot of strides. And as you mentioned, he's starting to see that potential that he flashed a lot in his freshman season in 2019. Obviously, starting up front in the offensive line, ASU's offensive line has been really good. They've kept him clean for the most part. He's not been under duress. They're a highly ranked unit. Darius Henderson was just named Offensive Lineman of the Week by the conference. They've been good against opening holes and establishing balance in the run game, but in pass protection, Jaden's mostly had a lot of time. And these last couple of weeks, we've seen him utilize that time really well. He's not been impatient. He's been staying back, and finding his guys downfield, making the plays, and taking the shots with his legs when he needs to. And he's been very judicious, and I think the last 2 games, been really smart about it. Herm always, ever since his freshman year, Herm has been on Jaden. He's like, know when the journey's over, because he knows that one hit, can certainly change the course of the season. And Jaden's been really cognizant of that, getting out of bounds, taking a slide, whatever he needs to do. But also a big factor, and something that also Herm has kind of reiterated early in the year a lot to the media when we were asking him, what's going on with this passing game? It's really kind of struggling. You guys aren't taking shots, so on and so forth. And he said, this is really just, the 6th, the 7th game that, going back to last season, that he's had with this group of wide receivers. Because again, they're a very young group overall, very overall inexperienced. And so it does take time to build that rapport. And not surprisingly, now that we're starting to see, this is 6th, the 7th, the 8th game with this group together, the results are improving. ASU did miss Johnny Wilson against UCLA, one of their big receivers, 6'7", good speed, but also battling drops, but one of those key cogs. But this group might just be one of those wide receiver groups that just like, it seems to have a different start every week, whether it's Ricky Pearsall against UCLA, LV Bunkley Shelton the week before, Johnny Wilson, maybe a guy who can step up, Andre Johnson. So it'll be interesting to see if this is able to continue. But I think that as that rapport strengthens, as Zach Hill gets a better feel for him, he certainly has the weapons around him. So I think that, hopefully that these last couple of weeks for Sun Devil fans can be encouraged that, full potential Jaden is in the process of being unlocked. Well,
what I really liked was the fact that it didn't need to be like a 35 pass attempt performance for him to be able to take the shots, right? Like some of the best quarterbacks, I think, or the most dangerous ones in that respect this year and in the Pac-12 between him and Chance Nolan at Oregon State have been kind of what the stat line at UCLA was. You can throw the ball 19, 20 times, but you're taking shots in those 19, 20 attempts that you're dangerous with every throw. And it doesn't need to be a 40 pass performance for you to find those shots. You can be hyper efficient with the shots that you're taking and be able to find places for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the Arizona State ground game being as effective as it is with Trainum, White, and when they mix in Daniel Ngata, I mean, that's really all you can really need is just to make sure that the passing game, keeps those defenses honest enough and stretched out enough that they're not putting 8 guys in the box like ASU did see those first couple of weeks when the passing game was struggling. Defenses brought more guys in the box, and the running game did not have its usual effectiveness. Last couple of weeks, with the success through the air, now you're seeing that balance, and now you're keeping defenses honest, and the results so far spoke for themselves.
I feel like they've rediscovered a lot of their physicality too. Like one thing that stood out in that BYU matchup, not just for Arizona State, but for Utah as well. I was stunned at how physical BYU was with both those teams and how both of those teams that have fashioned themselves physical power programs in the Pac-12 under Witt and under Herm really got moved around and almost dazed. It's like they didn't have a response until later in the game, like first quarter, second quarter, they were very much on their heels and didn't have much of a counterpunch to go back at BYU. It seems like Arizona State has rediscovered that, especially against a team like UCLA, where they fashioned themselves early in the year as a punishing physical team up front in the run game, defensively, a physical blitz scheme oriented team. Defensively, ASU actually had the counter punches to them this time around. Is that something that maybe is what can be expected going forward from Arizona State, is maybe that physicality has been rediscovered by this team a little bit?
I think so. And I think, when you look, for that physicality on the offensive side, I mentioned, ASU's offensive line has been generally pretty good this year. And against UCLA, I mean, they came in, I believe, averaging something like, allowing opponents to have like 63 or so yards on the ground. ASU put up nearly triple that amount. So the ground game, once they have that balance and you have both your top backs, I think that the physicality is really kind of the bread and butter of the Sun Devil offense, where that identity is, which then in turn helps kind of open up the passing game. But on defense, that's the real key for me for that physicality, because there's been stretches where ASU defense just seems like they're going to flip a switch and be like, all right, we're on lockdown. Whether it's like the first quarter against BYU where they gave up 12 yards, but then the second quarter, that switch gets flipped the other way and BYU puts up 3 40-yard plays. And then, just that switch gets flipped at halftime against UCLA. They shut them out for the entire half. So just with the veteran presence of that defense and with the young players they've been able to mix in, who have themselves been making big plays, I think the big thing is that can that physicality, can that intensity under defensive coordinator Antonio Pierce be sustained? Just kind of lock that switch on and not just go through, like again at the Colorado game where they had a number of drives just absolutely dominant. And then you let Colorado, of all teams, put up some points on you. So it's just like it's whether that consistency can be found, that physicality and that intensity, I think that's going to be a key differentiator. I think if you look at the offense, we talked about the passing game, but on defense, if they can just sustain that level, not have the peaks and the valleys and the kind of just the roller coaster nature, then I think ASU can really kind of untap that potential, make that run that a lot of people expect, because they certainly have the pieces on that defensive side at all 3 levels to be there.
So let's talk a little bit of week 6 here. Home matchup against Stanford after dark slot. So that it's going to be spooky, especially with Stanford playing the way that they have been playing the last couple of weeks. I look at the UCLA Stanford game as a little bit deceiving, just given the fact that was an 11-point game, but it was iced off very late with DTR making that throw late, I think 2 minutes or so left in the fourth quarter. Like that was a 4-point, 27, 28, 24 game all the way down to the wire, essentially. And so I don't necessarily look at that loss as indicative of the fact that UCLA is that much better than Stanford. In fact, I look at it as Stanford being right there. And then by the grace of some dubious officiating, getting one over on Oregon at the Farm too, under Tanner McKee, or with Tanner McKee as their starting quarterback. It seems like they are very much a team that can compete in this like tier 2.5 within the Pac-12, and they can catch you if you're not taking them seriously, right off the rip. What is the thing that makes you most nervous about this game? And inversely, what is the thing that makes you feel most confident in ASU going in?
So before the season, I put up my predictions, and I had this as a loss for ASU. I had this as like big red circle trap game.
Yeah.
Just because I know that the UCLA game was probably going to have some stakes to it, and whether ASU was going to be able to win on the road, that's kind of TBD. Now we know the answer. And so for me, it's like last week was, can ASU win on beat a quality team on the road? Okay, they've checked that box. Now for me, the big question this week is, can they handle success? And that's something that has not been consistent under Herm Edwards. They've had some big time wins in this program and also some big time letdowns. And then as you mentioned, it's Pac-12 after dark. It's going to be a short week. There's been too many examples in recent Sun Devil history where there's just that big letdown. And for me, that's the big cause of concern, because this is a team that is riding high right now, but are they going to, we've seen how kind of that was, like they came in to BYU, I think, with that same mentality. And I think that kind of contributed to some of that sloppiness that ultimately led to their demise. I'm going to be real curious about how that first quarter goes on Friday, just to see how they come out. If they have that same kind of second half intensity where the defense has that switch up, that they're playing lockdown, the offense is going to continue to take shots while being physical in the run game. If they have that, or if they're just going to try to be like, okay, we're home, we're ranked again. We did what we did last week. We can coast on that. Because Stanford's not a team that's not going to let that happen. I mean, especially with Tanner McKee now key in that offense and their own kind of big play passing game, I have some concerns there. And so I think that Friday is going to be a real close game. I mean, maybe a field goal or less, and perhaps Stanford's kicker situation might swing that one way or the other. But it's gonna. I am not expecting. When I saw the opening line of like ASU -12, I was like, no, no thanks. This is going to be a real close game.
I have a date for you. I did check on my other monitor. September 21st, 2019, a 7:00 game at Sun Devil Stadium. Number 24 Arizona State against Colorado. Colorado wins that game 34-31. That is, I feel like when you say like the bad vibe game that has happened under Herm, I feel like that's one of the ones you like can go back to as an ASU fan, especially coming off a 3-0, a 3-0 start with 2 winnable games in front of you after that. This, I think, is it fair to say that this is one of the bigger tests of the Herm era? Because I feel like a lot of these games we look at, we judge coaches on their big games, right? We'll judge a Mario Cristobal on the Ohio States, on the Auburns, on the Rose Bowls, and the Pac-12 conference championships. But even with him, and I feel like it's very similar with Herm in this respect, he's starting to be judged on these middle tier games, because that's where he's getting tripped up. Is we know you can get up for your big opponents, but can you get up for everybody? Under Herm, I feel like that's kind of been the same case in certain respects. There are other examples of big games that they haven't gotten out from, and that's, you can take that 2019 example and go to Utah at Rice Eccles. They lose 21-3 when they're 5-1 and number 17 in the country at that point. But I feel like for what we've seen out of Herm the last 4 years and the results, as we talked about in the preseason, they on paper look Todd Grahamish. The underlying stuff, the recruiting and the development, is very much a different situation. But the average layman fan is looking at 8-5 and going, well, what's the difference between that and 2015 or 2016, for example? So a game like this, to me, feels like it's a statement game for Herm and a statement game for ASU to prove that you can not get tripped up when you have all the weapons around you. Is it fair to say that maybe the narrative on him now is swinging to a place where these types of games are now becoming just as important for him as the biggest games are, the big ranked matchups are?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, again, the big question for me is, how does ASU handle success? Because under Herm, ASU's been ranked, a handful of times throughout in the his seasons here, but the stays in the polls have never been very long. It's usually just they'll pop in the mid-20s and then they'll pop back out, or they might win a game, get into the high teens, and then up, and then they get tripped up by somebody that they objectively should beat. And so that's going to be the case now, because you have Stanford on a short week, and then you have to go up to Utah, which granted they're scuffling in their own right, but that's been a team that ASU has needs to have some payback for that 2019. It's kind of a rivalry in the making, just the intensity that these last 5-6 meetings between these programs have. Now there's typically some South Division stakes along there. It's going to be another game on the road. So these next two games, I think, are going to be real crucial before ASU heads into that bye week, because the schedule is pretty favorable the rest of the way for the large part. So if ASU is going to be the kind of team that they think they are, that they think is that the statement that they made by going into Pasadena, knocking off a number 20 team in the country, these next couple games are games that they absolutely have to win. And if that narrative of Herm Edwards and building the program, reshaping the program, and 2021 being the referendum year, that this is good, the way we built this program is going to lead to this success, playing all the freshmen early, and the way we've changed recruiting, and the way we've changed our approach to the transfer portal, everything has built to this year and making a run at a Rose Bowl. You've absolutely got to maintain that level of success in all your games, and not just, pop up and knock off Oregon and cost them a playoff spot, not go to Michigan State and knock off a ranked team there, and then just, drop dumb games in between. You have to have that consistency. And if this is if this is ever going to be a time for ASU to make that run, take that next step up, it has to be this year.
So 2 more before I let you go. I'm seeing Trevez Moore in small spots, pop up on the stat sheet here and there, the LSU transfer. Kellen Dyche on the offensive line being a transfer himself is, he's a transfer from a couple of years ago, but, he has obviously been a plus for them, a plus get in the portal, I guess you could say. Looking at transfers, new guys that have come in as freshmen now from the last recruiting class, who's impressed you under the radar through 5 weeks for this team and has really revealed themselves to be a big contributor to the team's success so far?
Well, I mentioned a couple of guys that you mentioned. Kellen Dyche has been great at left tackle. Trevez Moore was really looking good before he unfortunately got hurt, and now he's out of lineup. But some of the young linebackers and the young defenders that really, we figure that when you look at ASU's defense, where the entire starting group is coming back, you figure, okay, that's going to be good. There's not going to be a whole lot of room for young guys. But young guys have really stepped up and made big plays. I mentioned BJ Green. He's been was a walk-on freshman from Georgia, but all camp, Robert Rodriguez, the D-line coach, was just raving about this guy, raving about his potential. And then Jermaine Lole goes down, testing the unit's depth, and all of a sudden, BJ Green's getting more meaningful reps, and he's again now tied for the conference lead in sacks through 3 weeks. Eric Gentry is a guy who came in, another true freshman from Philadelphia, 6'6", maybe 200 pounds. I mean, he is rail thin. And so just to be like, okay, this guy looks good in spring ball. Maybe he puts on 20, 30 pounds in a couple of years, and maybe he can be a contributor. Well, he's getting meaningful reps. He made that stop on DTR. He's and with Kyle Soley, one of ASU starting linebackers, kind of to set up the first half against Stanford due to a targeted call. I mean, Gentry's going to play some very key reps early on. And so all of a sudden you have these young under the radar type guys that are playing big, important minutes on a defense that was supposed to be this team's strength. Mason Williams is a young cornerback who was playing some very key roles. When Jack Jones missed the start, Mason Williams was able to slide in. So he's been really good, I thought, so far. Then you look over it on the offensive side of the ball. Ricky Pearsall had a breakout game, of course. He's been around the program for a couple of years, but he's a guy that it seems like Zach Hill just wants to get him involved in any way. He's thrown a touchdown pass. He's run for a touchdown. He's caught a couple of touchdowns. He is kind of like a jack of all trades, almost kind of an Antoine Randall, a little bit element for the Sun Devil offense. So he's been really good. Johnny Wilson, whenever he's been healthy, he's shown flashes, because last year as a true freshman in that 4-game season, had a lot of drops, but he was just starting to come around, getting that consistency with Jaden, developing that rapport. But unfortunately, he got dinged up. So, just some of those under the radar names that I think can be real key in helping ASU over the next, 5, 6, 7 weeks.
it's going to be really interesting to see them, kind of roll forward, especially with some big games ahead. I love the Antoine Randall L comparison. I love the nice little deep cut. Everybody's favorite Madden player, Madden 0405. That was easily your guy if you knew what was what. I'd be remiss before I let you go, asking about the investigation that is going on at ASU. I assume we're in the no news is good news phase. Interviews, I believe, had been underway or were starting to get underway down there in regards to everything that happened last year. Where are we at that point in process?
Yeah, that's their NCAA is doing their diligence and talking to people connected with the case. And of course, they already have that, the alleged dossier with all the, kind of hard evidence. But now they're doing the interviews and following up with coaches. And, that's going to be one thing, because coaches and players talk about it not being a distraction, but the fact of the matter is it's a distraction. It's taking up, at minimum, taking up mental real estate and time away from preparation for these games. So there is an impact. And but I think perhaps the most damning thing in kind of this period where they're still kind of, behind the scenes doing all the interviews and such is in recruiting. ASU's recruiting class has really just plummeted. I mean, in the spring, it was looking great. They had, four stars commits. Now they just have 5 total commits. They've most recently Larry Turner Gooden, another basically the crown jewel of their class. It was kind of expected for a long time, but he finally made the decommitment official. A couple other 4-star DBs also decommitted. They just picked up a 3-star D lineman out of South Carolina. But I mean, you look at look at the Rivals rankings. They rank the top 100 classes. ASU's not even there. I mean, they're below several FCS teams in terms of recruiting rankings, just because they just don't have the number of recruits. And it's a legitimate question of just like, well, is this coaching staff going to be there? What's the state of this program is going to be hammered with it. So I understand, commits or recruits and their families don't want to necessarily commit to Arizona State with so much questions. So this is probably going to be a situation where this investigation really destroys the traditional 4-year recruit type stuff in the ASU's go over the next couple of years, whether it's Herm and some semblance of this staff or another staff altogether, is really going to have to build their roster out of the portal, which I think is a real slippery slope and just kind of adds even further importance to finishing this season strong and just, kind of the old major league thing. You just might as well just win it all while you can, because you never know just when everything's gonna come crashing down. But yeah, right now it's there's still a lot of interviews to be done, but we don't know. Obviously, I think the expectation is that nothing will come before the end of the season, but just, I think the real X factor here is that just the NCAA started off things with so much information that they didn't have to go get. Somebody handed it over to them. So whether that speeds things up and it's not a multi-year process like University of Arizona basketball, I don't know. We'll see. Of course, he had the big conference and NCAA is having about their own future and their identity and just kind of their role and everything later this year. Who knows how that factors in? But yeah, I think the most immediate impact right now from that investigation is on recruiting, which is, by far the lowest in the Pac-12, which is 5 recruits or 5 commits. I believe the next closest team is like 8 or 9. So it's real tough times and really destroyed some really great momentum for a 2022 class that for the last couple of years, they've been talking about just like, okay, after coming in, getting established for a couple of classes, 2022 is where we're going to just make that big splash, make a run at the top 10. And they were off to that kind of start in March. And then the news fell and they have fallen off the face of the earth in that respect.
Whew, man, skies are blue down there. Clearly. That is, I picture it in a couple ways. It's like equal parts Miami, where you can't really defend yourself on the recruiting trail. So anybody can just say anything about you. And then, the other portion, as you mentioned, kind of the major league effect, you keep winning and that can kind of paper over some of the issues. The idea of filling out the class with transfers is very interesting. It's like the Jake Spavital approach at Texas State, where I think it was his entire class was transfers and not a single high school kid. But who knows, in today's world, maybe that can keep you going for a year if it doesn't absolutely torch what you do at the high school level. But it's an interesting story, certainly to follow. And yeah, Pac-12 football, it's never a dull moment over in our little corner. Brad, 3TV, CBS 5, where can we find you? Where can we find the work on social and everywhere else?
Yeah, give me a follow on Twitter at bdenny29. You can find Speak of the Devils anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Google, all those good places. So I encourage folks to tune in, drop a 5-star review, and follow along. That should be an interesting rest of the season and off season for a number of reasons.
I was going to say, look, if nothing else, it keeps business booming on the podcast, man.
Never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment. Brad, thank you.
All right, no problem.